Hey, content warnings for this chapter include sexism, because the doctor goes back and talks to Polly. He dismisses her concerns and basically thinks she's being crazy. That kind of sexism. There's also, they talk about the woman who died of a beating, and the bad choice in mythological being name comes back, and they use a really uncharitable, antiquated term for disabled, but the people who they're talking about were experimented on medically with their consent, so it's weird. Anyway, if any of these things are very triggering, skip this chapter. Otherwise, enjoy. Sin in Space, Chapter 14. It doesn't matter, Mimi said firmly. We still have to go through with the search. That's how I see it too, Tony admitted. We can't bring any accusations until we know our own slate is clean. If we could only get hold of the bloodhound. Bella refused. And that means no matter how carefully we search, he can still come in afterward and claim it wasn't done properly. Could we rent one or buy it? Gracie wanted to know. Government property only, Mimi told him. O'Donnell checked on that the other day. Okay, so we have to do it without the bloodhound. Right, Mimi agreed. Now let's get our plans organized. If we can start at dawn, maybe we can do the whole unpacking operation tomorrow. Then we can hit Graham. Means we'll have to leave crates open and repack them later, but I don't see any alternative now. How long's Graham staying, Tony? He said maybe 3 days. Okay, then that's how we've got to do it. Maybe by tomorrow night we'll know better how to get at the guy. They spent a busy 10 minutes outlining the plan of operations, and then the three men went out, leaving the details for Mimi to settle. Tony walked down the settlement street slowly, trying to get his thoughts in order. It had been a long day, 3:15 in the morning when Tad woke him, and now there was still work to do. Stopping in at the hospital to collect his bag, he found Graham kibitzing idly with Harv in his living room. Just waiting for you, Doc. Stillman stood up. I have to get over to the radio shack. Tad's on the PM shift this week, but he fell asleep before supper, so I've got to take over tonight. Tony surveyed his guest uncomfortably. Anything you'd like? He asked. We have to go out and see a couple of patients. Won't be too long. Could I go along? Graham asked. I'd like to, if it's all right with you. Sure. I want you to see the baby I was talking about anyhow. My other patient is pretty sick. You may have to wait while I look in on her. They stopped at the Radcliffes first, but Joan was asleep, and she usually got so little rest that Tony decided not to disturb her. Anna had said she'd had a fairly good day. He'd see her tomorrow. Where is this infant? Graham had asked as they walked down the Colony Street. Here, this is the Candros' place. Hello, Polly, Tony said as the door opened, even before he knocked. I brought Mr. Graham along to visit. I hope you don't mind. No, of course not. How do you do? Come in, won't you? Her manner was absurdly formal, and her appearance was alarming. Tony wondered when she'd last slept. Her eyes were over-alert, her lips too tight, her neck and shoulders stiff with tension. How's Sonny? He walked into the new room where the crib stood, and the others followed. He wished now he hadn't brought Graham along. The same, Polly told him. I just tried. You see? The baby in its basket was sputtering feebly, its face flushed bright red. We're going to lose that youngster, thought the doctor grimly, unless I start intravenous feeding, and soon. Tell me something, doctor, please, she burst out, ignoring the reporter's presence. Could it be my fault? I'm anxious, I know that. Could that be why Sonny doesn't eat right? Tony considered. Yes, to a degree, but I couldn't account for all the trouble. Are you really so tense? What's it all about? You know how it is with us, she said evasively. We tried so many times on Earth, and then here we thought at first it'd be like all the other times, but, Tony, do you think... is Mars dangerous? He saw she'd changed her mind in mid-confession and substituted the inane question for whatever she'd started to ask. Over the woman's shoulder, he looked meaningfully at Graham. The reporter grimaced, shrugged, and obligingly drifted back to the living room. Tell me about the murder, she said flatly. Oh, is that what you're jumpy about? I saw worse every night I rode the ambulance at Massachusetts General. What's that got to do with Sonny? I heard, she said, that she was beaten to death with a lot of light blows. No man would do that. And I heard that Nick Cantrella saw footprints out by the caves, naked footprints. He thought they were children's. Whose do you think they were? He asked, though he had a sickly feeling that he knew what she'd say. Polly moaned. It was brownies. I told you I saw one, and you didn't believe me. Now they've killed this woman, and they're leaving footprints around, and you still don't believe me. You think I'm crazy. You all think I'm crazy. They want my baby, and you won't listen to me." Tony thought he knew what was going on in her head, and he didn't like it. She had seen the attention of the colony shift from her baby to the Marcane search, and was determined to bring it back, even if it had to be by a ridiculous ruse. She'd heard all the foolish stories about the mythical brownies. She'd had a vivid anxiety dream, which, he reminded himself, she had finally admitted was only a dream, and now she was collecting evidence to build herself up as the interesting victim of a malignant persecution. "We've been over all this before," he told her wearily. "You agree that you didn't really see anything, and you agree that there couldn't be any brownies because no animal life has ever been found on Mars. No brownies, and nothing brownies could evolve from. Now, Doctor," she broke in, "I've got to show you something." She reached into the baby's basket and drew out something that glinted darkly in her hand. "Good Lord, what are you doing with a gun?" the doctor demanded. There was no more conflict on her face or hesitancy in her voice. "You can say I'm crazy, Tony, but I'm afraid. I think there could be such things as brownies, and I'm going to be ready for them if they come." As they walked down the street in a strained, embarrassed silence, Graham looked as if he wanted to ask something. He finally did. "By the way, Tony, do you know where I'm supposed to sleep? Or where I find my bag? It was on the plane." "May as well stay with me. And your baggage ought to be at the Campbells. Tad Campbell was that young sprout who deflated my fight with Brenner." The baggage, a sizable B4 bag on which Graham must have paid a ruinous overweight charge, was at the Campbells. After picking it up, the writer followed the doctor to his hospital hut. Tony snapped a heat beam on the 2 plastic chairs, standard furnishing of a Sun Lake living room, and took off his sand boots with a grunt. Graham rooted through his baggage, picked up Shabrir's gaudy package and hefted it thoughtfully, then shook his head and dove in again. He came out grinning with another bottle. "How about it, Doc?" he asked. "This is Earthside." "It's been a long time," Tony sighed. "I'll get a couple of glasses." The stuff went down like silk in fire. It had been a very long time. "What's about brownies?" the writer asked suddenly. "Couldn't help hearing part of that when I went out of the room." Tony shook his head. "Brownies? As if we didn't have enough trouble here without inventing Martian monsters." "Well, what about them? All I've ever heard is that deep purple scene in Granada's interplanetary show. It's silly stuff, but nobody's handled it yet at all except Granada. Maybe I could use something. It's a beautiful story if there's anything at all to back it up. Does anybody claim a connection between fairy book brownies and the Martian variety?" "2 ways. First of all, Mars brownies are just as much a fairy story as the Earthside kind. Second, somebody once suggested that the ones in the storybooks were the space-traveling ancestors of the present-day hallucinations." "Could be," the Gunther reflected. "Could be." "Could be a lot of rot," Tony said without heat. "Space travel requires, at an absolute minimum, the presence of animal life, or at least mobile, intelligent life. Show me so much as one preambulating vegetable on Mars, let alone a native animal life form. Then it's likely I'll think about brownies some more." "How about a declining race?" Graham speculated. "Suppose they were space travelers on a high level of civilization. They might have killed off all lesser life forms. You see it happening some on Earth, and back there it's just a matter of living space. We don't have the problem Martians had to face of dwindling water and oxygen supplies. Probably got them in the end and destroyed their civilization. Except," he added, "for the ones who got to Earth. I understand from authoritative sources that the last expedition to Earth was led by a guy named Oberon." Graham chuckled and drank, and then asked seriously, "Has anybody ever seen one, except Granada?" "Hundreds of people," Tony said dryly. "Ask any one of the old prospectors who come into town hauling dirt. They've all seen him, lived with him. Some even claim to have been at baby feasts. You'll get all the stories you want out of any of those old geezers." "What are brownies supposed to look like?" the writer insisted. Tony sighed and surrendered, recognizing the same intense manner Graham had displayed in the lab. The man was a reporter, after all. It was his business to ask questions. Tony gave him what he wanted, with additions, explanations, and embellishments. Brownies. An intelligent life form, either animal or mobile vegetable. About 1.5 meters in height. Big ears, skinny arms. supposed to be naked remnants of a once proud Martian civilization, except that there were no other remnants to support the theory. In the habit of kidnapping human children, except that there was no specific authenticated case of a baby's disappearance, and eating them, except that that seemed too pat and inevitable an idea association with the kidnapping, the sort of additional embellishment that no good liar could resist. It's an old prospector's yarn, Tony wound up. The homesteaders picked it up to frighten kids into sticking close to home. There are hundreds of people on Mars today who'll tell you they've seen brownies, but not only is there no native animal life of any kind on Mars today, so far as we can tell, there never has been. No ruins, no old cities, no sign of civilization, and not so much as one single desiccated, dried-out scrap of anything resembling an animal fossil. That's strictly negative evidence, Graham pointed out. He emptied his glass and poured another drink for both of them. Cigarette? Tony shook his head. I gave up smoking long ago. We all quit sooner or later. Too much trouble to keep tobacco burning. He reached out to pick up his empty pipe from the table beside him, and he clenched the stem comfortably between his teeth. Graham repeated. Strictly negative evidence. But on the other side you have footprints, for instance, and eyewitness stories. If you're talking about the cataract-covered eyes of old Marsmen, Tony retorted, don't call it evidence. It wouldn't be, Graham agreed, except that there are so many of them. I'm beginning to think there's a story in it after all. You mean you believe it? The doctor demanded. Do I look crazy? I said it was a story. So you came 150 million kilometers on a rocket, and then 4 more hours across Mars in a beat-up old rattletrap of a plane, the doctor said bitterly. You eat food that tastes like hospital disinfectant, and live in a mud hut. Also, you can go back home and write a nice piece of fiction about brownies, a piece you could have dashed off without ever leaving Earth. Not exactly, the Gunther said mildly. I was only thinking of using the brownies for one chapter. Local color, tales and legends, that kind of thing. You could get plenty of stories back on Earth, Tony went on bitterly. Stories worth writing. How about Paul Rosen's story? There's a real one for you. Rosen? Graham leaned forward, interested again. Seems to me I've heard the name before. Who is he? Not was, is. He's still alive. A cripple nobody knows. Tell me about Rosen. The writer filled their glasses again. I'll tell you about Mars. It's the same story. You came to write a book about Mars, didn't you? Well, Mars, this Mars, without oxygen masks, is Rosen's work. Rosen's lungs. And you never heard of him. Rosen was the medical doctor aboard the relief ship and the one that found what was left of the first colony. He had a notion about the oxygen differential and was convinced that it wasn't responsible for the failure. He was wrong, of course, but he was right, too. To prove his point, he took off his mask and found he didn't need it. His assistant tried it and nearly died of anemexia. That proved that some people could take Mars straight, and others couldn't. When the ship got back, Rosen went to the biochem boys with his lungs. They told him a few cc wouldn't be enough to work with, so he volunteered for an operation. Most of his lung tissue was removed. He was crippled for life, but they tracked down the enzyme that made the difference and worked out a test. That I remember, said Graham, continuing to fill the glasses almost rhythmically. Half the guys I met in Asia claimed they enlisted because they weren't Mars-worthy, and life wasn't worth living if they couldn't go to Mars. That was the beginning of it, Tony said. The ones who passed the test began to come over. $1,000 a day prospecting, and always the chance of finding bonanzas. At first, they were pork and beaners, but the Mars vegetation they brought back took us one step closer to fitting into the Martian ecology. The biochem boys came up with a one-shot hormone treatment to stimulate secretion of an enzyme from the lining of the pylorus. It's present in most people without the shot, but not enough to break down the Martian equivalent of carbohydrates into simple sugars, which the human body can handle. You asked me before what all the shots you got on board the rocket ship were for. That's one of them. It means you can handle the Mars plants, which don't contain compounds poisonous to Earth animals. The other shots you got were to protect you against all the rest of the things that killed off the first pork and beaners. Fungi, ultraviolet damage to the eyes, dehydration, viruses. For every shot you got, 6 of the first explorers and prospectors were killed or crippled to find the cause or cure. 5 years ago came the payoff. The biochem boys got what they'd been looking for ever since they'd first sliced up Rosen's trick lungs. They synthesized the enzyme, your little pink oxen pill, and that did it. That's when the Sun Lake Society was founded, and the new rocket fuel 2 years ago made Sun Lake a reality. With oxen and 4 trips a year, we can make out until we find a way to get along without Earth. Sun Lake is Mars, Graham. Sun Lake is going to be left when you crazy bastards back on Earth blow yourselves up. The other colonists here aren't Mars. They're part of Earth. When Earth goes, they go. Sun Lake's all's going to be left. Couple of catches, said Graham, trying to make a glass stay put so he could fill it. Commish Bell and his eviction notice, and you still need oxen. Can you make that in a lab? Not yet, Tony brooded. He had forgotten the lovely optimism that could be poured out of a bottle. Guess I had enough to drink. I have a hell of a day ahead of me.